Nicholas Reed stepped into the corner store for a bottle of water. He didn't expect to walk out with 3 starving little girls, a broken past he couldn't ignore, and the beginning of the only story that would ever truly matter. The line at the small corner grocery store moved slowly, but Nicholas Reed didn't mind. It was a cold, gray afternoon, the kind where the sky pressed low over the city, and even the air felt heavy. He had stepped away from a boardroom meeting to clear his head, choosing to walk rather than have his driver take him back to the office. With his dark hair slightly tousled from the wind and his sharp blue eyes scanning the shelves, he looked like any other customer. No one there knew he was a millionaire CEO, the mind behind one of the country's largest logistics empires. To them, he was just another tall man with a quiet expression and bottled water in his hand. That's when he heard it, a small, uncertain voice near the checkout counter. He turned his head slightly and saw them, 3 little girls standing on tiptoe, trying to place a loaf of bread on the counter. They looked to be no older than 6, identical with long, wavy brown hair and striking blue eyes that shimmered even under the flickering store lights. One clutched a crumpled dollar bill, while the other 2 stood silently behind her, eyes wide and uncertain. The cashier's voice was loud and firm. "This isn't enough, sweetheart. I'm sorry, you need at least $2 more." There was no adult nearby, no parent reaching into a pocket to help, no sign that anyone else was with them. The store became strangely quiet. Nicholas watched as the oldest girl, though it was hard to tell who exactly was the eldest, tightened her grip on the bread. "We're just really hungry," she said, her voice so steady it felt rehearsed. "Our mom said she'd be back. She went to get a job." The cashier hesitated, eyes scanning the small group. "Where's your mom now?" Another girl answered, "She's been gone 2 days. She said to stay home, but we were hungry, so we came here." Nicholas felt something unfamiliar stir in his chest, something that pushed right past logic and into instinct. He had heard stories like this before, through reports, through outreach programs his company occasionally supported, but this was different. This was in front of him. This was real. And those 3 small pairs of eyes were staring down the adult world with empty stomachs and the quiet determination of children who had already learned not to expect kindness. Without thinking, he stepped forward. He didn't speak to the girls at first. Instead, he turned to the cashier, reached for his wallet, and calmly paid for the bread, along with a small carton of milk, a pack of fruit snacks, and 2 soft buns from the bakery section. Then, crouching down beside them, he offered the bag of food and said gently, "Hi. I'm Nicholas. Can I sit with you for a moment?" The girls looked at one another, unsure, but didn't run. They took the bag and moved to the corner bench near the window, where they began eating in silence. He followed, keeping a respectful distance. After a few minutes, he asked, "Do you live nearby?" One of them nodded. "In the big gray building with the broken window." Another added, "But we're not allowed to tell people." He didn't press further. Not yet. Instead, he watched them eat, noting how they chewed slowly, not for manners, but to make the food last longer. He asked their names, and they told him, Jenny, Lily, and Sarah. Triplets. No father. Their mother, Marissa, had been looking for work but hadn't come home in 2 days. They'd waited as long as they could. That's when he made the first of many quiet decisions. He called his assistant and cancelled all his meetings for the rest of the day. Then he made another call, to a contact he knew in Child Protective Services, but when they told him that the girls would be separated and placed into different homes while a case was opened, something in him snapped. These children had clearly fought to stay together. The thought of tearing them apart was unbearable. So, he made a different choice. "I'm not a stranger," he said softly. "I want to help. Would it be okay if you came with me somewhere warm?" The girls hesitated. Then Jenny asked, "You're not going to take us somewhere bad, are you?" He shook his head. "No. Just somewhere safe." She looked at her sisters, then took his hand. It was the beginning of something none of them understood yet, but it had started with a loaf of bread and a kind of hunger that went far beyond food. Nicholas led the three girls to his car with a gentleness that surprised even himself. They walked close together, not holding his hand but following his steps like shadows unsure of the light. The black SUV, polished and spotless, looked far too sleek for the reality they brought with them: mud on their shoes, breadcrumbs clinging to their sleeves, the scent of the street still clinging to their clothes. But he opened the back door, let them climb in, and fastened their seatbelts one by one. Not a single one of them said a word on the drive, but every few moments he caught glimpses of them in the rearview mirror, watching the world pass with wide, exhausted eyes. He didn't turn on music or make a call. He just drove, his thoughts a storm of questions he didn't yet have answers to. He brought them to his apartment, a spacious penthouse in a high-rise overlooking the city. It was a place of glass, steel, and silence, filled with clean surfaces and expensive furniture, but as he opened the door for them, he realized just how sterile it truly was. The girls stepped in cautiously, pausing just past the threshold. Sarah took off her shoes without being asked. Lily clutched the bag of food. Jenny was the first to speak. "This place is too shiny," she said, not as a complaint but a fact. Nicholas smiled faintly. "It's just a place. You make it something more." He led them to the kitchen, where he poured them warm cocoa and sliced apples. He watched as they drank slowly, politely, even though he could tell they were still hungry. He told them they could eat as much as they wanted, and only then did they begin to eat freely. He pulled out a blanket and laid it on the couch, letting them sit wherever they liked. After a while, he sat down on the rug beside them and asked gently, "Can you tell me more about your mom?" Jenny did most of the talking. "Her name is Marissa. She used to work in a hotel but they said they didn't need her anymore. We lived in a basement, but when the landlord saw we didn't have money, he told her to leave. She said she'd find something, that we should be brave and wait. We waited 2 nights. Then we got scared." Nicholas listened closely. Every detail made the knot in his chest tighten. He had heard stories like this before, in quarterly reports and donation requests, but never like this, never in his living room, never looking into the eyes of the children who had lived it. He didn't say anything right away. Instead, he made another silent decision. After the girls had bathed, he showed them how the faucet worked and let them choose from oversized shirts of his to sleep in. He called a private investigator he trusted. He gave him everything he knew: the mother's name, the area they'd been living in, her last job. "Find her," he said simply. "No matter what." He made up 3 beds that night in the guest room using the spare linens and pillows. The girls didn't protest or cry. They just curled up together on the same mattress, one large comforter covering all of them, holding each other like they had for every night they could remember. He watched from the doorway for a moment, unsure if he had overstepped something or not done enough. But then Lily looked up and said softly, "Can we stay here for now?" And he answered without hesitation, "As long as you need." That night, Nicholas didn't sleep. He stood by the window, city lights flickering far below, trying to piece together what had happened in less than 12 hours. This morning, he was a CEO with a full calendar, a $1 million merger on his desk, and a life built on logic and solitude. Tonight, 3 little girls were asleep under his roof, trusting him with something sacred. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in a long time, he didn't care. All that mattered was that they were safe. He would make sure they stayed that way. The next morning began quietly. Nicholas woke early, long before the sun rose, his mind already spinning with questions he didn't know how to answer. He made coffee out of habit, then stood at the kitchen counter sipping it, staring into the dark windows, listening for the smallest sounds. Eventually, he heard soft footsteps, bare feet padding cautiously down the hall. Jenny appeared first, wearing one of his oversized t-shirts that hung nearly to her knees. She paused at the kitchen entrance, unsure whether she was allowed to be there. He gave her a gentle smile and nodded toward the stool by the island. "Hungry?" She nodded shyly. One by one, Lily and Sarah followed. None of them spoke much, and none of them asked where they were or why they were still there. Instead, they quietly accepted bowls of oatmeal, slices of toast, and small glasses of juice. Nicholas wasn't used to cooking for anyone, especially children, but he tried his best. When he offered them more, they looked at each other first, silently confirming it was okay, then nodded together. He noticed how they waited for one another before eating, as if their hunger came second to staying connected. It wasn't a survival habit anymore, it was a ritual, a bond forged by uncertainty. After breakfast, he sat with them in the living room and tried to gently ask more questions. "What do you remember about the last place you stayed?" he asked. Jenny described a basement apartment with one mattress and a bucket to catch the leaking water. She said their mom used to sing to them at night to distract them from the cold. Sarah didn't say much, but she drew with a crayon she'd found in her pocket, 3 girls and a woman standing under a cracked ceiling. Lily, the most observant, finally asked, "Are you a good guy or just someone who wants to feel good for helping?" The question hit him like a punch. He didn't flinch, but he took a moment before answering. "I don't want anything in return," he said. "But I do want you to feel safe." Lily nodded and kept coloring. By mid-morning, he had arranged for one of his assistants to bring by some clothes, blankets, and art supplies. He didn't want the girls to feel like visitors. He wanted them to have a sense that this place, for now, could belong to them too. He watched as they explored the apartment with quiet curiosity, peeking into rooms, tapping their fingers along the glass windows, testing out the buttons on the TV remote. When they found a bookshelf filled with hardcover biographies and economics texts, Jenny looked up at him and asked, "Do you have any books with pictures?" He laughed for the first time in days. "Not yet, but I will." Later that day, he received a call from the private investigator. Marissa Brooks had still not been located, but they had found the basement unit the girls had described. It had been boarded up after the building was condemned. Neighbors said the woman had been looking pale and sick, possibly malnourished. One mentioned seeing her faint on a sidewalk near a bus station 3 days ago. Nicholas felt the weight of that image like a brick in his chest. A woman collapsing while her daughters waited, starving. He asked the investigator to widen the search to local clinics and hospitals and update him every 2 hours. As the sun dipped lower, the apartment changed again. Nicholas ordered food, simple pasta, garlic bread, and salad, and they all ate at the dining table together. The girls were still quiet, but their eyes looked brighter. When Sarah spilled a bit of juice, she flinched, as if expecting to be yelled at. Nicholas calmly handed her a napkin. "Happens to me all the time," he said. She didn't respond, but she stopped shrinking into her chair. After dinner, they watched a cartoon movie he'd never seen before. The girls sat close to one another on the couch while Nicholas sat nearby on the armchair. Halfway through, Jenny whispered, "She's lucky the bear didn't leave her," referring to the character in the film. Nicholas didn't comment, but the words stayed with him. When it was time for bed, they didn't resist. They brushed their teeth, changed into clean t-shirts, and crawled under the same covers as the night before. This time, Lily looked back as he turned out the light. "You can leave the door open a little," she said. "In case we need to hear someone nearby." Nicholas nodded and left the door slightly ajar. That night, he sat at his desk, staring at the paperwork for a project he could no longer focus on. His thoughts were with the girls, with their mother, with the strange feeling growing stronger inside him, a need to do more than offer temporary help. He thought about the weight of responsibility, about the life he'd built so carefully, and how suddenly it had cracked open to make space for something entirely unexpected. He didn't know where the road was leading, but he no longer felt alone on it. 3 small voices, cautious but resilient, had already started to guide the way. The 4th day began with a call that jolted Nicholas awake before dawn. He reached for his phone, heart pounding, fearing bad news but hoping it was the update he had been waiting for. The private investigator's voice was urgent but steady. A woman matching Marissa Brooks's description had been admitted to a city hospital under the name Jane Doe 2 nights ago. She had collapsed on a sidewalk near a shelter and had been unconscious ever since, suffering from severe dehydration, exhaustion, and exposure to cold. No identification. No emergency contact. Nothing but the clothes on her back. Nicholas thanked him, dressed quickly, and left a note for the girls, telling them he'd be back soon and that everything was okay. At the hospital, the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead as he was led through a long corridor by a nurse. The woman in the hospital bed looked fragile, her hair tangled and her skin pale, but Nicholas recognized her from the photograph the girls had drawn. Her hands were calloused, nails broken, and there was a faint scar near her temple that Jenny had once described without knowing it was unique. A doctor explained that she had likely been on the streets for several days without food or rest. Her vitals were stable now, but it would take time for her to fully recover. Nicholas sat by her side for an hour, just watching her breathe. There were tubes, monitors, the hum of machines around her, but all he could think about was how close this woman had come to disappearing completely. When she finally stirred, her eyes fluttering open, they were the same blue as her daughter's. It took her a few moments to focus, and then panic flickered across her face. "Where are my girls?" she asked, voice hoarse and cracked. Nicholas stood slowly, careful not to alarm her. "They're safe," he said gently. "They're with me." She blinked at him, confused. "Who are you?" He told her his name and added, "They came into a store looking for food. I was there. I couldn't let them go hungry." Tears welled in her eyes before she could stop them. "I told them I'd come back. I didn't mean to disappear. I was just trying to find something, anything." He nodded. "You didn't fail. You survived. And so did they. That matters." She turned her head away, ashamed. "You're just some rich man who felt sorry for us." He hesitated for a moment, then sat down again. "I'm a man who saw 3 children trying to survive alone. And I've already lost someone once. I wasn't going to let that happen again." Marissa remained silent after that, but her hand, weak and trembling, didn't pull away when he placed his over it. Before leaving the hospital, Nicholas arranged for her continued care and made it clear he would cover all costs. He also left his contact information with the staff and asked them to notify him the moment she was strong enough for visitors. On the way home, his thoughts were a chaotic swirl of emotion, anger at how easily people like her slipped through the cracks, grief for all the things she and her daughters had endured, and something else he hadn't dared name yet. Back at the apartment, the girls ran to him when he walked in, their voices overlapping as they asked where he'd gone. He knelt down, arms around all 3 of them, and whispered, "I found your mom." They froze. "Is she okay?" asked Jenny, eyes wide. "She's alive," Nicholas said, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "She's in the hospital, and she's going to get better." The girls didn't speak for a moment, but then Lily broke into tears, quiet, relieved sobs that Nicholas gently held her through. That evening, the air in the apartment felt different. There was hope now, cautious and fragile, but present. The girls drew pictures to bring to their mom, and Sarah asked if she could bake cookies for her, so she can eat something sweet when she wakes up more. Nicholas, who hadn't baked anything in years, found himself in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, carefully measuring flour beside a child who had been starving only days before. It was imperfect, and the cookies were slightly burnt, but when Sarah laughed at the misshapen ones and said, "They'll still taste like love," Nicholas realized that healing had already begun, not just for them, but for him too. That night, he placed a framed photo of the girls on his nightstand, taken earlier that day with flour on their faces and joy in their eyes. He didn't know what would happen next, what Marissa would want, what the courts might say, how the future would unfold, but for now, the most important thing was that a broken family had not been lost. They had been found. The 5th day brought with it a kind of stillness that felt like the world was holding its breath. Nicholas had promised the girls they could visit their mother, and from the moment they woke up, they were restless with anticipation. He dressed them carefully, helping button small cardigans and brushing their soft curls back with the same precision he used to prepare for board meetings. But today felt more important than any meeting he'd ever attended. As they stepped into the car, each girl clutching something for Marissa, Jenny had her drawing, Lily brought a flower she'd picked from a sidewalk pot, and Sarah held the slightly misshapen cookies from the night before. Nicholas felt a weight in his chest he didn't know how to describe. At the hospital, the girls hesitated as they reached the door of the room. Through the small window, they could see their mother sitting up, her eyes tired but brighter, hands folded neatly in her lap. It was Lily who finally stepped forward and turned the handle. The door opened with a quiet creak, and for a moment, no one spoke. Marissa's eyes welled with tears the second she saw them. Her arms were too weak to hold them all at once, but they didn't care. The girls rushed forward and clung to her, pressing their faces into her chest, whispering, "We missed you," over and over again. Marissa stroked their hair, whispering apologies between sobs. "I tried. I really tried. I just wanted to keep you safe." Nicholas stood at the door, watching, letting the moment be theirs. When Marissa finally looked up at him, her expression was soft, almost unsure. "Thank you," she said. "For everything." He shook his head gently. "They're the ones who gave me more than I could have imagined." The nurses gave them time alone, and Nicholas stepped outside to give the family space. As he sat in the waiting room, he found himself remembering moments from his past, his own daughter's laughter before the accident, the hollow silence of losing her, the way he'd shut the world out afterward, burying himself in numbers and control. He had believed that grief would harden him forever, that compassion was something reserved for people with fewer wounds. And yet, here he was, holding coloring books in a hospital bag, waiting for 3 little girls and their mother who had quietly reshaped his life in the span of a few days. After an hour, the girls came out, each one smiling, cheeks tear-streaked but glowing. "Mom says she's going to get strong again," Jenny said, holding Nicholas's hand. "She wants to come home," Sarah added. "But only if it's okay," Lily finished, her voice cautious. Nicholas knelt in front of them, looked into each of their eyes, and said, "She's your mom. If she wants to come home, then it's not just okay, it's right." Over the next few days, he worked with the hospital social worker and his legal team to create a plan. Marissa would need a few more weeks of medical care and therapy, but she was determined to recover. Nicholas offered her a room in his apartment when she was discharged, not as charity but as a transition, a way to rebuild without tearing the family apart again. Marissa initially refused. She was proud, deeply ashamed of her past failures, but eventually, she looked at her daughters and said yes, not for herself, but for them. Meanwhile, Nicholas rearranged his schedule to stay home more. He transformed his guest room into something warm and welcoming, bought books with pictures, and even set up a small desk for schoolwork. The girls began to settle in, their laughter growing louder each day. He enrolled them in a nearby school, accompanied them on their first day, and stood at the gate until they turned and waved goodbye. That evening, as he returned home to find Marissa sketching out a list of things she wanted to do once she regained full strength, find work, take parenting classes, volunteer, he realized this wasn't just about helping anymore. This was about building something new. A different kind of family, one made not by blood or obligation, but by choice, by timing, by a shared understanding of loss and hope. As night fell, the apartment felt fuller than ever. The girls were asleep, curled up with stuffed animals Nicholas had picked out, the city glowing softly outside the windows. Marissa sat on the couch, a warm blanket around her shoulders, looking at a framed photo the girls had given her, Nicholas standing behind them, all 3 girls beaming. "They call you Dad sometimes," she said quietly. Nicholas looked at her and nodded. "Only when they mean it." There was no more denying it. He was no longer just the man who happened to be at the store that day. He was someone they trusted, someone they leaned on. And as he looked around the room, at the life that had begun in chaos but was slowly knitting itself into something whole, he knew he didn't want to go back to the way things were before. Not ever. The sixth chapter of their story unfolded in the soft rhythm of ordinary days slowly becoming extraordinary. With Marissa now out of the hospital and staying at Nicholas's apartment, a strange but beautiful sense of routine began to emerge. It was not without its difficulties. After all, healing was never linear, but the apartment that once echoed with cold silence now rang with footsteps, laughter, and quiet voices whispering in the early morning light. Each day began with the same ritual. Nicholas, once a man whose mornings were dictated by financial briefings and strict schedules, now woke to the sounds of cereal being poured into bowls, Marissa humming softly in the kitchen, and the girls chattering about dreams or cartoons. He had never imagined a life where his first task of the day would be helping 3 6-year-olds find their socks, but it had become his new normal. And strangely, he had never felt more grounded. Even Marissa, whose body still bore the weight of exhaustion and trauma, began to regain her strength. She helped with breakfast, tidied up, and slowly started stepping outside for short walks. She didn't smile all the time, but when she did, it reached her eyes, and Nicholas noticed every time. The girls, now attending school, came home each afternoon bursting with stories about classmates, colors they'd discovered, and teachers they liked or didn't like. Nicholas listened with genuine interest, setting his phone aside, sometimes canceling meetings just to be fully present. His staff noticed the change. The once intimidating CEO who used to measure time in dollars now excused himself from board calls because Sarah forgot her lunchbox or Lily's science fair is tomorrow. At first, his inner circle assumed he was having a breakdown, or a crisis. But the truth was much simpler: he was becoming someone new. Or perhaps someone he had forgotten how to be. Despite the small victories, Marissa still struggled. There were nights when she couldn't sleep, haunted by the memory of cold sidewalks, the helplessness of watching her children suffer, the shame of asking for help. Nicholas never pressured her to talk, but one evening as they folded laundry together, she finally did. "I always thought I had to do everything alone. That needing help made me weak." Nicholas looked at her, setting down a towel. "You kept 3 kids alive with nothing. That's not weakness. That's survival. And now you don't have to do it alone anymore." Sometimes, she would watch the girls play with Nicholas and wonder what would have happened if he hadn't been in that store that day. Would her daughters still be together? Would she even be alive? She hated how much had depended on chance, but she couldn't deny that something extraordinary had happened, something that had not only saved them but was gently stitching them back together. One weekend, Nicholas took them all to a park outside the city, a quiet place with trees that still held the last colors of autumn. It was the first time Marissa had been out for more than a short walk, and the first time the girls had seen her run, even if only a few steps. They played tag, took pictures, and had a picnic with peanut butter sandwiches and juice boxes. It wasn't extravagant, but it felt like magic. As the sun set and they packed up, Jenny looked up at Nicholas and said, "This was my best day ever." He smiled, lifting her into his arms. "Mine too." Later that evening, Marissa asked him a question she had been holding back. "Why are you still doing all this? We're not your family." Nicholas didn't answer right away. He glanced at the couch, where the girls were asleep in a tangle of limbs, and then at her, his voice steady but low. "Because maybe I was waiting for a reason to stop being alone. And you all gave me that reason." It was not a declaration. It wasn't romance. It was something more fragile and more honest, the kind of truth that didn't need to be dressed in promises. They weren't perfect, and their future wasn't fully clear, but the lines between stranger, protector, and something deeper had already blurred. That night, as Marissa tucked her daughters into bed and Nicholas sat in the hallway reading the same children's book for the 3rd time, neither of them said it aloud, but they both felt it. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were becoming a family. Chapter 7 began with the unexpected arrival of a letter that reminded everyone how fragile their new reality still was. It came in a plain envelope, slipped beneath the door without a sound, and bore the insignia of the County Child Welfare Department. Marissa found it first. Her hands trembled as she opened it, her breath catching before she'd even read a word. It was a formal notice. A caseworker would be visiting within the week to assess the children's current living situation and Marissa's parental capacity, given her recent hospitalization and history of homelessness. Though the letter was routine procedure, it felt like a storm cloud gathering above everything they had built. When Nicholas came home that evening, Marissa handed him the letter without saying anything. He read it once, then again, slower, his jaw tightening. She watched his face, bracing herself for disappointment, for frustration, maybe even regret. But instead, he folded the paper calmly and said, "We'll be ready." It was the first time she realized that he didn't see this as her battle alone. Over the next few days, they prepared, not just for the visit, but for what it meant. Marissa met with the therapist Nicholas had found for her, something she'd avoided for weeks, finally willing to confront the guilt she had buried so deeply. She talked about the nights she spent hiding with the girls in subway stations, the job interviews she never got to finish, the quiet terror of knowing she was running out of time and options. Her therapist reminded her that surviving wasn't failure, it was proof she never stopped trying. Nicholas, meanwhile, worked with his legal team to ensure that if anything went wrong, the girls would not be taken away. He had started the process of becoming their legal guardian, with Marissa's full consent. She had made that decision not because she wanted to give up her role, but because she finally understood what partnership meant. He wasn't replacing her. He was standing beside her. The night before the visit, the apartment was spotless, but the air was tight with tension. The girls didn't fully understand what was happening, but they could sense the unease. Nicholas sat down with them and explained as gently as he could. "Someone is coming to make sure you're safe and happy here," he said. "It's their job to ask questions. All you have to do is be honest. You don't have to say anything special, just the truth." Jenny asked, "Will they take us away?" He looked her straight in the eye and said, "I won't let that happen." The next morning, the caseworker arrived. She was polite but distant, her eyes constantly scanning, observing, noting every detail. She interviewed Marissa separately, then the girls together, then Nicholas alone. The questions were clinical, the tone neutral, but the tension was palpable. When asked why he had taken in 3 children who were not his, Nicholas answered simply, "Because they were alone and they shouldn't have been. Because I lost my own daughter and I know what it feels like to live with silence. Because they gave me back something I didn't even know I'd lost." When the visit ended, there was no clear answer. The caseworker said she would file a report and left with a polite nod. The silence that followed was heavy. Marissa sat on the couch, the girls curled beside her, and Nicholas stood by the window, watching the city stretch into the afternoon. Hours passed, but no one could settle. It wasn't until Sarah climbed into his lap and whispered, "Did we do good?" that the heaviness finally broke. He held her tightly and said, "You did more than good. You were brave." That night, for the first time since the girls had entered his life, Nicholas cried. Not from sadness, but from the overwhelming weight of everything he had tried to hold together. Marissa sat beside him, their shoulders touching but no words exchanged. She understood without asking. It wasn't about winning a case or proving worth. It was about how deeply they had all become a part of each other's lives. No matter what the papers said or what the government decided, they were already a family in every way that mattered. Outside, the city glowed quietly, unaware of the small miracle unfolding in one corner apartment. Inside, the warmth of hard-won safety wrapped around them like a blanket. They had weathered another storm. And they were still standing, together. Several weeks passed before the official letter arrived, bearing the seal of the family court and stamped with the final words they had all been waiting for. Nicholas opened it in silence, his hands steady but his chest tight with anticipation. As his eyes scanned the text, a slow breath escaped him. The decision was clear: full legal guardianship of the girls was granted jointly to Marissa and Nicholas, with acknowledgement of the extraordinary care they had provided under challenging circumstances. They were not just a temporary arrangement anymore. They were, in the eyes of the law, a family. When he told the girls, their reaction was immediate and uninhibited. Jenny squealed and jumped into his arms. Lily hugged Marissa so tightly she nearly knocked her over, and Sarah, always the quiet one, simply sat down and smiled in a way that said everything without needing words. Nicholas felt a wave of emotion that caught him completely off guard. He had signed billion-dollar deals with less intensity than he felt holding those 3 children and hearing them call this home. The following days were filled with lightness that hadn't existed before. There were no more visits to prove their worth, no more questions about where they belonged. They decorated the apartment together, adding color and warmth to the once sterile space. Crayon drawings replaced modern art. The guest room was transformed into a shared bedroom filled with soft blankets, fairy lights, and shelves of picture books. Marissa even took an online course in early childhood education, determined to turn her instinctive love for her daughters into something more formal, something she could use to help other children one day. Nicholas, for his part, restructured his work life entirely. He appointed a new COO, reduced his travel, and began working remotely 3 days a week. Where his office once displayed trophies and press features, he now had framed photos of school plays, messy birthday parties, and afternoons in the park. People at work noticed the change in him. He was still sharp, still driven, but no longer guarded or cold. His boardroom presence had shifted from icy confidence to something warmer, more balanced. He was no longer leading from ambition alone but from purpose. One Saturday afternoon, they held a small celebration in the apartment with a few close friends and neighbors. It wasn't grand, but it was sincere. The girls wore matching dresses in soft pastels, each of them beaming with pride. Marissa made cupcakes from scratch, and Nicholas, surprisingly, helped without setting off the smoke alarm this time. They played games, told stories, and laughed freely. At one point, Jenny stood on a chair and raised a paper crown over Nicholas's head, declaring him the best backup dad in the world, which quickly earned a chorus of cheers from the other 2. Later that night, when the guests had gone and the apartment was quiet again, Marissa found Nicholas on the balcony, looking out over the city. She stood beside him, arms folded, the wind gently tugging at her hair. "You saved us," she said. He shook his head, looking at her with steady eyes. "No. You just needed someone to stand still long enough for you to catch your breath. You did the rest." She didn't argue. Instead, she took his hand, and for a long moment, they just stood there in the quiet comfort of what they had become. Inside, the girls had fallen asleep in a tangle of limbs and blankets on the couch. Nicholas walked over, carefully lifted each of them, and carried them to bed. As he tucked the last blanket around Sarah, she stirred just enough to whisper, "I knew you were magic." He smiled, brushing her hair back gently. "No, sweetheart. You were." That night, as he turned out the lights and closed their bedroom door halfway, just enough to let in a little light, just as they liked it, he realized something he hadn't been able to name until now. For all the pain, for all the loss, for all the uncertainty, this wasn't just a story of rescue. It was a story of return. Of coming back to life. Of rebuilding from almost nothing and creating something real. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were living. And in the quiet glow of that truth, Nicholas finally let go of everything that used to define him and held on, instead, to what he had found, a home. In my view, the ending of this story is not just heartwarming, it's transformative. It shows that love, trust, and healing can grow in the most unexpected places, even between people who were complete strangers just days earlier. What began as a simple act of kindness turned into a redefinition of what it means to be a family. Nicholas, a man once consumed by loss and isolation, opened his heart in the most human way possible, not with grand gestures, but by showing up day after day, by choosing them. Marissa, a mother broken by circumstance, rose again not as a victim but as a fierce and steady force for her children. And the girls, with their quiet resilience, reminded everyone around them that sometimes, hope arrives in the form of small hands and big hearts. This was never a fairy tale. It was raw, painful, and real. But that's what makes the ending so powerful. It proves that the most lasting miracles aren't the ones that fall from the sky, they're the ones we build, brick by brick, through courage, compassion, and the decision to believe in each other.